In this video, we're going to talk about how to create autogen buildings and vegetation in the FSX and P3D worlds. Both of them, unfortunately, use the exact same tool set. In fact, as near as I can tell, there really haven't been any changes made in the last 14 or so years to the tools required to do autogen, and most of it is pretty straightforward. I'm going to assume, before we get started here, that you have the P3D or the FSX SDKs installed on your system. That's kind of a must-have in general for development, so be sure and do that. I'll put a link in the description, and once you've got that installed, everything else should go fairly simply. So I have two shortcuts on my desktop here. One is to Prepared v4 and one is to the Prepared v4 SDK. The first thing I'm going to do before I get started is I'm going to open my shortcut to my Prepared v4 here, and I'm going to go to the root folder of the sim under autogen, and I'm going to copy the default.xml file. This is a really important setup step for the annotator. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to go in here to my SDK. The annotator, which is the tool that we're going to use to create the autogen, is located in the SDK under World Auto Generation. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to paste my default XML in here. It was already in here, so it's just asking me if I want to replace it. Alright, so now we've basically got everything set up and ready to go. I'm going to double click annotator.exe, and what you see right away is this sort of confusing mass of pop-up windows here. This has got to be one of the worst UIs of any program I've seen in ages. But once you get used to it, it's not that big a deal. You basically have three main windows that you're concerned with. So when you first see these screens that pop up, you can actually close the Find Results screen, you can close the Find window, you can close Properties. For the simple first steps we're going to take here, you don't need any of those. Next thing is going to the window that's marked Autogen Configuration Editor, and you're going to hit File, Open, and in the same folder as the annotator, you should find your autogen descriptions.spb. SPB is just a sort of a compiled version of an XML file that both FSX and P3D use. And what you will then get are these model entries. You can close that window. You basically want to pare everything down to where you have your main annotator window, which is this black screen, your control strip, which is always going to hover on top of everything else, which is like the really sort of the guts of the program. This has all the controls and all the different modes you use to add autogen. And then you've got your descriptions, your configurations here. And through the configuration editor, you can actually launch other windows. For instance, we'll be using the vegetation groupings a lot, which just lets you set the GUID in your annotator here so that it knows which kind of building, which kind of library object, or which kind of vegetation you're trying to lay down. For some reason this isn't responding. I don't need it open right now, so I'm not going to worry about it. In fact, I'm just going to move, I'm going to close this window, I'm going to move the configuration editor off to my second monitor, and I'm going to go here to the main window. What you essentially do when you're creating autogen is you open up your ortho photo that you've already compiled and placed in the sim, and then you're going to actually draw footprints of buildings, objects, and or vegetation over the top of that in little boxes that will then tell the sim, use these footprints, create appropriate buildings or vegetation, sort of using the map that we've set up for it. So first thing you want to do is open your ortho photo. And I'm going to go here and open, I believe this is my ortho. This is Randolph Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. We're going to use this as our example. To navigate around your main screen here, you use the middle mouse button to pan and the mouse wheel to zoom in and out. Now I've already gotten to start with some of this, but I think what I'm going to start off with first is just explaining how to create buildings. In this case, there are a lot of little suburban housing tracts near the field that we'll want to create. And by the way, essentially as you're making your autogen, as you're creating it here, you can see there's a grid pattern, the QMID grid here. This is how the sim is going to split up your autogen into individual AGN files. If you've ever been in your texture folder for any scenery that has autogen included, you'll see there's just dozens usually of these little AGN files, and these are the actual footprint data organized along this sort of magenta grid that you see here. We're going to, there's several modes you can use here in your control strip. You can pan and zoom, which I already showed you can do with the mouse button. You can select, which is essentially, let me zoom in here a little bit with the mouse wheel. Essentially with that, you're just selecting footprints that you've already laid down. So I just selected some vegetation, or come over here and select some houses. And they turn yellow when you select them. Vegetation is green by default, buildings are red. And they'll turn yellow when you select them, so that you know exactly which ones have been selected. And then you can do any number of things. You can move them around. So say I wanted to move a building here. Let me zoom in a little tighter. And just select one building, and you can just left click on it and drag it around on your screen. Put it wherever it needs to go. Like say you created one and it was off by just a little bit. After creating it, you can just position it right where it goes. And you can do that with multiples. You can select large groups and do the same thing. And all the same, Windows rules apply. Control Z will undo, and you have quite a few levels of undo here. Control C and Control V work. So for instance, if I hit Control C on a building, hit Control V, it's going to add in a new one, although I did select them both. The delete key will get rid of things, so you just select something and delete. It's all pretty straightforward, pretty easy to use. To create buildings, let's create some more of these houses here. All you need to do, let me get over to an area where I don't have any yet. You can see I've been busily creating these footprints. Alright, so here we have our ortho, it's very clear where the houses are. We're going to go up here and select building. And before we get too far into this, there's one other thing. You want to tell the annotator essentially how tall your buildings are going to be by default, because it knows from your footprint how wide and how deep they are. What it doesn't know is how tall you want them to be. And whether or not, like this is an area with really short buildings, 1, 2, or 3 story perhaps, so even the commercial buildings won't be terribly tall. If you were in an urban environment where you were creating sort of a Manhattan kind of look, then you'd want the buildings to be much taller. And the way you do that is you go up under File in your main window to Properties. And here are your annotation properties for this. Essentially what this means is of the buildings that I lay down, and it kind of uses the dimensions as a guide, the vast majority are going to be 1 to 2 floors. Most of these are houses. There are going to be a few that are 3 to 5 floors, so I put that up on about the second peg there, third peg. There are no 6 to 8 floor buildings, there are no 9 to 12s, so I'm just going to leave those down. Under the textures here, you could specify custom textures if you created roof textures or row house textures. In this case, we're going to leave everything at default. So I'm just going to hit cancel there. So let's create some buildings. Hit the B key on the keyboard or click the building link here. By default, it says default autogen, 1 roof. That's fine. And then all you have to do to create them, because it not only needs to know the height and the width of the building, the footprint basically, but it needs to know which part is the front face. All these houses of course face the street that they're on. And to create the front face, you go to one corner of your building here, go to a front corner, click and hold and drag the mouse. And when you let up on the mouse, then you drag to create your depth. One more left click, and that's the building. Let me get in a little closer here so you can see it more clearly. Create another one. I'm going to click on a front corner. This white line is the front of my building. Let go of the mouse, draw it back to create the depth, and so forth. And you can see it doesn't take any time at all to create. I don't like the way that was. Get rid of that and go back in here and try that again. You're not creating complex shapes, you're just limited to boxes, but they'll be good enough for the autogen look. So essentially you're not only creating the face when you draw that, when you drag that first line, you're also telling it what rotation to put the building at. So you just want to kind of see how the building is oriented and then draw it back. Come on now. Create the whole thing. Now in a lot of cases, to speed things up, you know, like this particular scenery has a lot of houses that are at the exact same orientation. So say I've got a whole row of them like this. And I want to annotate these. Rather than just click, drag, click, drag, click, drag to make all these, what you can do is go into select mode, use the S key and click on one of the buildings, hit Control C to copy, and then a really handy thing is every time you right click, it basically pastes whatever you copied in the exact location where you're clicking. So I'm just right clicking and then I'll move them around, right click, move them around, and you can see very quickly you can populate whole neighborhoods provided the buildings are all roughly the same size and the same orientation, the same rotation. So for an autogen like this, that's super helpful and really speeds things up. The other really cool thing you could do, let me make another example here, go back to building mode. I'm going to select, make a few of these, so S, copy, I'm just right clicking to create new ones. What I could do, if I really had a lot of buildings I wanted to create in a hurry, is I could zoom out a little bit and select all of these. Try that. It can be tricky to select multiples. Select a bunch of these and hit copy, and then I could basically right click to paste and paste whole lines of buildings. Now of course these will all have the same height and width. That might not be what you're after, but if in fact you do have a bunch of similarly shaped houses like these and similarly sized, that's a really quick way to place a whole bunch of them at once. And the cool thing is that the autogen system itself within the sim will take care of making them look unique. We'll actually like randomize the textures used and the roofs and things like that. So it's not really something you have to be concerned with. Alright, so let's zoom out. We're going to go over here, and now the next thing we're going to do, the other thing I want to accomplish in this video is show you how to place the vegetation. Now I've already got a whole bunch of trees placed here. These are placed as small individual tree boxes. So that's one way you can place vegetation. Let me go to an area here that we haven't done yet. Zoom in a little bit. Alright. So I'm going to bring back my autogen configuration editor window here. And I'm going to go up under View Windows, and I'm going to choose Vegetation Groupings. This is the screen where you basically get to choose what kind of vegetation you're trying to place. Now it happens that I have done a little experimentation already and discovered that what I want for this particular project is something called Terrain Autogen Class Dry Crop in Town. It gives me the kind of tree mix that I want. So if I wanted to select that here, I would have to go down and find it. Bunch of Orbex entries here, so let's say Terrain Autogen Class Dry Crop in Town. There it is. So And you can actually open that up and see what kind of, depending on where in the world you place it, this is North America South, you can see actually what kind of mix it's going to be. It's going to be placing a mix of bushes, dry and wet, some forest, city dry, which is like aspen and chestnut, cottonwood trees, elm, little eucalyptus. You want to be careful with those. Eucalyptus can look a little weird in the sim. But essentially, in order to use this mix, you click here to select the dry crop in town, and then on our control strip, you'll just hit the GUID, set the GUID, and it will grab whatever GUID is being used and display it here. So you can see that you're using Terrain Autogen class, dry crop in town, for your vegetation. Hit the V key or click the vegetation button, and you can then click and drag to create individual trees like that. No front face to those, so there's no worries about drawing height, width, and depth and everything. You just literally click and drag, and when you let the mouse up, there you go, your trees. Now you can do the same thing with this we did with the houses. You can go into select mode, hit copy, and then just use right click to paste more. If I want a line of trees here, I could do that. Just go along here, right clicking, placing trees exactly where I want them. And if I don't like where one is, I can select it and just move it. And it'll just keep pasting the same kind of vegetation. Now it'll vary because we chose a grouping that has several different types of tree in it. So it should look pretty natural when you get it into the sim. Another way to do vegetation is with what they call a polygon region. So like if you have a forest area here and you wanted to place all sorts of trees from this dry crop in town region, but you didn't want to have to sit here and click on them individually, you could use the polygon region, which is the let's look at the I key, or just click the button here, polygon region, and then you can just define where you want your group of trees to be, and it will fill it in itself. When you've done defining everything, right click and hit add point and close, and that creates a whole group of them. So you can very quickly build up forested areas here without having to do all the individual foresting, and it will still follow very nicely the orthophoto that we have. Now some groups work better than others. Some groups are more dense than others. So you'll just have to experiment with the different tree types, the different tree groupings, in order to get one that works really well for you. But this is at least a start, and will help you kind of get going in the first place. So when it comes to creating autogen, that's pretty much all there is to basic houses and basic trees. And if we go back here to our buildings, commercial buildings are just like houses. You're just clicking and dragging, and essentially the longer or the larger the footprint, the more likely that it's going to make it a taller building too. So some of these, they might end up being those 3, 4, or 5-story buildings because they have larger footprints. They're not just houses, obviously. And when you hit save, essentially what it will do is just write those AGN files back to that appropriate texture directory that corresponds to your ortho photo that you've opened. So you don't actually have to do anything in terms of installing or moving files. They're automatically put where they belong, provided your ortho is in the correct scenery folder and is in an active scenery. So that is essentially it when it comes to the basics of buildings and trees in autogen.